On the 4th of February, 1924, one of America's great rifle companies was sold on the courthouse steps in New Haven, Connecticut. By the account that has come down to us, the auction of the bankrupt Marlin Firearms Works drew a crowd of exactly this size: a few curious children, a small dog, and one lawyer. The lawyer's name was Frank Kenna. He was the only bidder. The winning price for the property of a company that had armed the American frontier and built machine guns for the Allies in the First World War was $100, although Kenna also had to take on the firm's mortgage, some $95,000, a serious sum in 1924. He was a Yale-educated attorney. He knew almost nothing about making guns, and he had just bought, for the price of a good rifle and a mountain of debt, a company his family would run for the next 86 years. Hold that image, because Marlin's whole story lives inside a strange symmetry. It began, in its modern form, at a bankruptcy auction where nobody wanted it. And it would very nearly end, 96 years later, at another bankruptcy auction, this time carved out of the corpse of a company we have already buried in this series. Between those two auctions, Marlin did something none of the great names around it managed. It was the eternal underdog, the second-place rifle, the company that spent 100 years losing to Winchester, and it finally won. It outsold its rival, outlasted its rival, and became the #1 maker of lever-action rifles in the world. And then it was destroyed. Not by Winchester, not by any competitor, but by another gunmaker that bought it and did not understand what it had bought. The clearest sign that Marlin had died was two letters stamped on the side of a barrel. This is the story of a company that was saved by an auction, killed by an owner, brought back from the dead by a rival, and held together through all of it by the initials of a man who had been in his grave for over a century. Every week we tell the stories of the engineers, the factories, and the decisions that built or destroyed the world's most important firearms brands. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins with a machinist at Colt. John Malin Marlin was born in Connecticut in 1836. He trained as a tool and die maker, the most precise trade in 19th century metalwork, the craft of building the tools that build everything else. During the Civil War, he worked at the Colt plant in Hartford, at the very heart of the American gun industry, learning how a great firearms factory actually ran. If you have seen our films on Colt and on Winchester, you already know this world. A few square miles of Connecticut River Valley that produced, in one lifetime, most of the guns that armed a nation. Marlin came up inside it. By 1870, at the age of 34, he hung out his own sign on State Street in New Haven, a few miles from Winchester's factory, and began making his own line of small revolvers and derringers. He was, from the start, a man obsessed with quality, and his skill with tooling meant he could build the machines to make his own guns to his own standard. In 1875, he took up the Ballard, a single-shot rifle with a fine reputation on the target range, refined it, and built Marlin's early name on it. In 1881, he incorporated the Marlin Firearms Company, gathered a team of gifted designers around him, and did the thing that would define the company for the next century and a quarter. He went after Winchester. Winchester owned the lever-action rifle. The lever gun was the American rifle, the gun of the frontier, the cowboy, the homesteader, and Winchester's models were the standard. Marlin's answer, the Model 1881, was a big-frame lever-action chambered for powerful cartridges like the .45-70, a rifle one-period advertisement simply called the Buffalo Gun. It was, by some judgments, more advanced than what Winchester was selling. But being a little better was never going to be enough to unseat the giant next door. Marlin needed something Winchester did not have. In 1889, he got it. Marlin introduced a lever action with a solid top receiver and side ejection, the Marlin Safety. Here is one sentence of why it mattered. On a Winchester, the spent case flew straight up and out of the open top of the receiver, which meant the top of the gun could never carry a scope. On a Marlin, the top of the receiver was closed solid, and the case kicked out the side, so a shooter could mount a telescopic sight directly over the bore. In 1889, that seemed like a minor engineering choice. Across the 20th century, as optics went from a curiosity to standard equipment on every deer rifle in America, It became the single feature that would let the underdog finally beat the champion. Side ejection was Marlin's edge, and it was built into nearly every rifle the company would ever make. And onto the barrels of those rifles went a mark, a small oval stamp bearing two letters, JM, for John Marlin. It was, in the strict sense, a proof mark. The stamp a gunsmith pressed into the steel to certify that he had fitted that specific barrel to that specific receiver, that the headspace was correct, that the rifle was safe to fire. It meant a human being had checked the work and put the founder's initials on it as his word. For over 100 years, almost every Marlin carried it. Remember those two letters. They are the thread that runs through everything that follows. The designs that came out of that New Haven shop had staying power that is almost hard to believe. The little .22 lever action of 1891 evolved into the Model 39, a rifle so good, so loved by generations of shooters, that it holds the distinction of being the longest continuously produced rifle in the world, in and out of the catalog from 1891 into the 21st century. It was the favorite of exhibition shooters, and the sharpshooter Annie Oakley is said to have owned one. The larger Model 1893 would, decades later, become the rifle that made Marlin a household name. These were not fashions. They were designs so right that the company would still be selling their descendants a century after they were drawn. John Marlin died in 1901. His two sons took over and pushed the company to diversify, and when the First World War came, Marlin transformed into something unrecognizable. Bought by a New York syndicate and renamed the Marlin Rockwell Corporation, it became one of the largest machine gun manufacturers in the United States, turning out the M1895 Colt Browning gun and an aircraft machine gun of its own for the Allied war effort. It even made razor blades. For a few years, the little lever gun maker from New Haven was a sprawling war industry conglomerate. And then, as happened to so many arms makers when the war contracts vanished, you have seen this exact pattern in our Winchester and Remington films. The piece nearly killed it. The overbuilt company could not find a footing in the civilian market. By 1924, the Marlin Firearms Corporation was bankrupt, its property hauled to the courthouse steps, which is where a lawyer, a small dog, and $100 bid come back into the story. Frank Kenna did not buy Marlin to flip it. He bought it, took on its debts, and set about the slow work of turning a bankrupt war plant back into a rifle company. It was not easy. The Depression throttled the whole industry through the early 1930s. But the Kenna family had something that, in this series, turns out to be rarer and more valuable than any patent. They intended to keep it. They were not a conglomerate, not a fund, not a holding company looking for a return. They were a family that owned a gun company and meant to go on owning it. And under them, across the next 86 years, Marlin did its finest work. Frank Kenna died in 1947. His son Roger became president the following year, and in 1948, Marlin released the rifle that would define it forever. The Model 336 was the old 1893 design, modernized, a stronger round bolt, a better extractor, that signature side ejection and solid top receiver. It sold, at launch, for $74. It would go on to become one of the best-selling hunting rifles in American history, more than 4 million built, and for decades the second best-selling high-powered sporting rifle the country ever produced. The only rifle ahead of it was the Winchester Model 94, the lever gun it had been chasing since 1881. In 1953, Marlin added its micro-groove rifling for better accuracy. It moved into a plant in North Haven in 1969, and alongside the 336 came the Model 60, a humble .22 semi-automatic that would sell in the millions and teach more Americans to shoot than almost any rifle ever made. This was the long golden age, quiet, family-run, defined not by drama but by the steady output of good rifles at fair prices, every one of them wearing that little JM oval on the barrel. And somewhere in the 1980s and 1990s, without any single dramatic moment, the underdog finally passed the champion. Marlin overtook Winchester to become the world's leading maker of lever-action rifles, the position it would hold from then on. In 2000, it expanded, buying the old New England gun houses Harrington and Richardson and New England Firearms, and even the storied L.C. Smith shotgun name. And then came the final proof of how the century-long race had turned. In 2006, Winchester's own New Haven factory, the birthplace of the American lever gun, closed its doors, and production of the legendary Model 94 stopped. The rifle Marlin had spent its whole life chasing went out of production first. Marlin had won. It had almost no time to enjoy it. In 2007, a private equity firm named Cerberus Capital Management, which had already assembled Remington and a dozen other gun brands into the debt-loaded conglomerate it called the Freedom Group, agreed to buy Marlin for around $42 million. The Kenna family, after 86 years and 3 generations, was out. If you have seen our Remington film, you know exactly what kind of machine had just taken hold of Marlin. And you know how this goes. It went that way here, only faster. The new owners moved first on the smaller pieces, closing the old Harrington and Richardson plant in Massachusetts in 2008 and shifting its work into Remington's giant factory at Ilion, New York. Then, in March 2010, came the announcement that ended an era. Marlin's historic North Haven plant would close. 265 workers would lose their jobs in phased layoffs. The plant that had made Marlin rifles, that had made firearms in Connecticut since 1870, 141 years of continuity, would be shut by the middle of 2011. The workers said they felt blindsided. One man who had been there 19 years learned in a 3:30 meeting that he was being phased out. Production would move to Ilion, to Remington. And here is the thing that no spreadsheet at Cerberus seems to have understood, said plainly afterward by a Remington foreman himself. North Haven's machinery was old, some of it worn out, hard to move and reinstall, and it had been coaxed into producing quality for decades only by skilled workers who had spent their lives learning how to bring the best out of it. Almost none of those veterans moved to New York. And Remington had no history with lever-action rifles, a fundamentally different, fiddlier thing to build than a bolt gun, full of small parts that have to be fitted by feel. You cannot move the knowledge with the machines. The knowledge walks out the door with the people. Marlin had spent 140 years teaching hands how to build a lever gun right, and in one plant closure, most of that was simply gone. The result got a name, coined by the fans who loved these rifles and now watched them fall apart: the Remlin. Marlins built at Ilion in the years after the move developed a reputation for poor fit and finish, rough actions, gaps in the wood, barrels that didn't shoot the way a Marlin was supposed to, warranty problems that dragged on. The company that had beaten Winchester on quality was now shipping rifles its own customers didn't trust. And this is where those 2 letters come back, and where they do something extraordinary. Because the fans needed a way to tell a real Marlin from a broken one, they turned to the barrel. A rifle stamped with the old JM oval had been made in North Haven, by the original Marlin company, by the hands that knew what they were doing. A rifle without it, one marked instead with Remington stamps, was a gamble. Almost overnight, the founder's initials became a warning label. John Marlin's mark, applied for over a century as a routine proof of good work, became the single most reliable way for a buyer to avoid the guns the company was making now. Prices of clean JM-stamped Marlins climbed on the used market as buyers hunted them specifically. The founder, dead since 1901, had become the conscience the company had lost, the 2-letter reminder of a standard it no longer met. Then the machine that had swallowed Marlin came apart. Remington Outdoor, drowning in the debt Cerberus had loaded onto it and the aftermath of the Sandy Hook lawsuit, filed for bankruptcy in 2018, restructured, and failed again in 2020. In August of that year, Marlin stopped making rifles entirely. In the September 2020 bankruptcy auction, the same fire sale that dismembered Remington into pieces sold to strangers, Marlin came up for sale, a legendary name with no factory, no active production, and a ruined reputation, cut out of the wreckage of its owner. For once in this series, the auction had a good ending. The buyer was Sturm Ruger and Company, one of the largest firearms makers in America, and a company known, above almost anything else, for manufacturing quality. Ruger paid about $28.3 million for Marlin, And then it did something that money alone does not require. Ruger's executives had visited Ilion before the auction to understand what they were bidding on. When they won, their engineers moved fast, before winter, to extract the Marlin tooling, some of it in 40,000-pound loads, and haul it 650 miles south to Ruger's plant in Mayodan, North Carolina. And rather than simply switching the machines back on, they spent nearly a year going over every detail of how a Marlin was built, re-engineering the process to Ruger's standards. The first new Marlin came off the Mayodan line on the 30th of September 2021, a model 1895 in .45-70, serial number RM0001001. When it reached the reviewers, the verdict was close to unanimous, and it came from people who had spent their lives around these rifles. One gunsmith who had worked on Marlin lever guns for over 40 years called the machine work the best he had ever seen on one. Ruger followed with the 336 and the 1894. And in a decision that tells you exactly how Ruger understood what it had bought, the company left its own famous name off the guns. The rifles say Marlin, and they say Mayodan, North Carolina, carrying forward John Marlin's 150-year legacy, not overwriting it. The old JM proof was replaced by a new stamp, RM. But the thing the JM stamp had always meant, a company standing behind the fit of every rifle, was back. So Marlin lives, and lives well. It is, today, a thriving line under Ruger, its classic rifles back in production, and back to the quality that made the name. On the collector market, the old JM-stamped North Haven guns remain prized above almost all others, not out of pure nostalgia, but because for a stretch of years, that stamp really was the difference between a rifle built right and a rifle built wrong. Marlin is the rare story in this series with a third act that is not a eulogy. Rigby closed. The Lee Enfield's factory was privatized into apartments. Mauser was raised by a foreign army. Remington was sold for parts. Marlin was sold for parts too, and then someone put it back together and made it deserve its name again. Which brings us, at the end, back to the two letters. Think about what the JM stamp actually was. Not a logo, not a marketing device. It was the mark a working gunsmith pressed into steel to say, I fitted this barrel to this action, I checked the headspace, this rifle is right, and I am putting the founder's initials on it as my word. For 130 years, it was so routine that no one thought about it. And then, in the company's darkest stretch, it became the most important thing on the gun, the one honest signal. In a market flooded with rifles, the company itself could no longer build to standard, of whether a human being who knew what he was doing had stood behind the work. The initials of a man dead since 1901 became the last line of defense for his own company's reputation. And when Ruger set out to bring Marlin back, what it was really trying to do was earn the right to that stamp again. To build a rifle a craftsman could put his word on. What the Marlin story really tells is not a story about lever guns. It is a story about the difference between a name, which can be bought and sold and loaded with debt at an auction, and the thing the name is supposed to certify, which lives not in the logo or the trademark, but in specific hands, in a specific plant, in the accumulated feel of people who have built the same rifle 10,000 times. Cerberus bought the name and thought it had bought the company. It hadn't. The company was 265 people in North Haven who knew how a lever should feel when it closes, and when they were let go, the name kept going while the thing behind it fell apart. Ruger understood the difference. It didn't just buy the name. It moved the machines, rebuilt the process, retrained the hands, and re-earned the stamp. Somewhere tonight, there is a Marlin lever action leaning in the corner of a hunting cabin. A .30-30, walnut and blued steel, the side of the receiver solid so a scope can ride on top. The lever closing with that smooth, exact feel that beat Winchester in the end. On the barrel, if it's an old one, there is a small oval with 2 letters in it. A man named John Marlin never saw that particular rifle. He has been dead for more than 120 years, but his initials are on it, because once, that meant someone had checked the work and found it good. The lever still closes true. For most of this company's life, that was exactly what the stamp promised. For a few dark years, it was the only thing you could trust. And now, under a new mark, it means that again. If you want to keep hearing the stories of the engineers, the factories, and the companies that were lost, sold, and, every once in a while, actually saved, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.